Well, while they get to my slides, hi, I'm Steve. I was happy to be asked to do this talk, and I went and prepared about 140 slides to address the topic very thoroughly, and then I realized I had 15 minutes to speak, and so I happily whittled it back to a whopping 47 slides, which I'm going to skip about half of as we walk through this. So what is a distributed energy resource? Physical and virtual assets deployed across the distribution grid, typically close to load and behind the meter, usually, used individually or in aggregate to provide value to the grid. Solar storage, energy efficiency. This information is taken from a report that AEE did, but I added CHP and cogen, and here in North Carolina, probably biogas is probably worth considering in this category as well. But these are all things that can be aggregated to provide services to the electric grid. Thanks to Ivan, we were texting last night trying to figure out the best way to kind of define DERs. And, you know, I will say that, you know, you could really characterize almost everything we do in solar as a DER in comparison to, say, a nuclear power plant. And so really the question is, where do you draw the line? And, you know, in most cases, we're talking about these types of assets that are affecting distribution level loads. You know, there's a lot that goes on in the world of grid modernization, and I'm not going to talk about any of this because we've got other panels to address it later today. But almost all of these things have some impact on how DER fits into the system, and so I thought it was important to at least throw it up there and say there are a lot of things to track, a lot of things that are affecting this conversation. Cost trends for DER, you know, you've all seen this, and this is actually a utility scale chart. Let me see if this dot's working. There we go. This is a utility scale chart, but you can always see solar. You know, it starts at the highest number. I remember in 2009 we were, you know, 26, 27 cents a kilowatt hour. And, you know, you can watch it drop like a stone down to being the low-cost resource down here, or at least tied for the low-cost resource by 2018, and still falling. It's been pretty breathtaking what's gone on with solar. Other resources, you know, have done well as well. But this is utility scale. And so it's important to note that at the utility scale, prices have dropped like a stone. That has had an impact on solar's application in other fields, but not as much as we'd like. And so, you know, with regard to utility scale, we're seeing renewable energy beating coal, and in some cases with storage beating natural gas directly on cost at this point. This was just a quote that I found in an article from Forbes Online that was talking about, you know, the impacts of the price drops, but we're really seeing some pretty staggering things that when I got into solar in 1993, you know, these were things we used to fantasize about, you know, and it's all starting to come to pass at this point. It's been really amazing. So what gets interesting here is when you start looking at the cost differentials of different applications of PV, and boy, I got to really press that button to get that laser pointer to work. But at any rate, if you look at the top 3 bars, you can see the difference between solar PV for rooftop residential, the kind of cost band, solar rooftop for commercial and industrial, and then you get down to community solar, and then you work your way down into the utility scale solars that are down at $40 to $46 and $36 to $44. You know, there's a pretty big gap between where we are with utility scale and DER solar if you're talking about stuff that's behind the meter or close to the meter. And that is starting to change, but we still have a lot of work to do. This is why it's so different. This is from Woods Mackenzie Power. This is kind of by segment. You can see, you know, between 2017 and 2018 Q4 numbers, looking at the different sectors of solar use. And you can see in residential Q4, these first 2 bars, you can see how much of the bar is this part. It's supply chain, overhead, and margin, basically soft costs. You know, this is one of the biggest components as you get into residential systems. Not surprising. You got a lot of small systems. You got a lot of different customer interactions that are involved. You got a lot of things that you have to do once for large systems that you have to do multiple times for lots of small systems. That's the big barrier to getting rooftop solar going. I'm going to skip that and just go right to, you know, what's interesting also is watching where we are with when you start matching solar with storage. And again, you see the same kind of discussion. You know, storage for utility scale is been breathtakingly falling in price and is very low. But when you start matching it into other applications with the residential side or the commercial and industrial standalone storage even, commercial industrial with solar here, you can see that the prices are substantially more. Solar and storage is going to create a lot of opportunity at the utility scale first, but it's certain niche applications at the utility scale. At the residential level and the commercial level, storage is going to open up a lot of doors, but we're not quite there on price yet. And we've got a little bit ways to go before solar and storage at the residential level or even the commercial level is going to make sense. But we're getting closer and closer every day because the price keeps falling. So those are just some of the big cost trends. On the deployment side, this is kind of the solar market deployment, if you want to look at it that way. And this is, again, Woods Mackenzie and SEIA projecting out into the future. And you can see, residential markets are larger than commercial markets, but way smaller than the utility scale market. It was interesting to me that, it was right around 2014 when residential markets started to surpass the C&I markets. Those rooftop commercial systems are much larger, but we continue to struggle with the C&I market as probably the most challenging piece of the rooftop market. Residential's making a lot of headway. These are some of the major players that have been, of course, Solar City became Tesla, but you can see over this period, which players are doing the most in the space. But you can also see that the residential really is outstripping the commercial installations around the country. And there's a lot of reasons for that. And some of the years where we've seen drop-offs in both technology applications were in 2015, 2016, when there was a lot of churn around net metering. We saw a lot of attacks nationally on net metering, trying to dismantle it. Net metering is kind of a brute force tool, right? I think if you're honest about it, you have to say that net metering makes a lot of sense in a startup market. It's a very valuable tool to get, a market going. But once you reach a certain level, it's probably a little too brute force. And so finding that transition period is what we're struggling with. And I think a lot of states maybe started examining that question prematurely based on where their market deployment was. So let me touch on a couple other DER technologies. This is the CHP deployment, and I found this to be interesting. So it looks like there's a pretty sizable drop-off in the amount of CHP installation, but the operational capacity is staying relatively flat. That's basically new installations replacing existing installations that are being retired. But CHP is not growing in its overall scale, but it's modernizing and probably becoming more efficient. Another trend I wanted to look at, this is the storage deployment again, and you can see how fast that's growing, and you can see the key states. North Carolina not on that list yet in terms of top 10 states, but we've got a lot going on in the states, so maybe we'll climb in there in the not too distant future. This is kind of a map of the deployments and some of the announced storage projects around the country, so you can dig into this map when you look at my slides later online. With 15 minutes, we got to move here. This is smart meter deployment. So this is, the gateway to being able to do more on the electricity side, or excuse me, on the energy efficiency side at the residential and the commercial level. Again, top 10 states by penetration. North Carolina is not in the top 10, but North Carolina has deployed a lot of smart meters in recent years. And so we are getting the infrastructure in place to do more of this kind of work. And I'm going to skip this, but this is the DER discussion. So from a policy standpoint, we touched on energy efficiency and some of the elements of that in our drawings at the table. This is ACEEE's state-by-state scorecard, and you can see the arrow down at the bottom there. North Carolina is 26 out of 50 states in terms of the ACEEE efficiency scorecard. And you can see that, we do reasonably well in transportation policies. We do relatively well in government initiatives, but we have a pretty sizable gap here in utility programs. The combined heat and power number for us is fairly low, and we don't have any appliance standards, apparently. We've got no points there. If you can't read this chart, the colors show the maximum number of points in each category, and each bar shows what that state got in that category. And so that's how it sums. This is a really neat study if you've never looked at it. It kind of gives you a sense across the board, talks about some of those transportation issues, talks about, kind of buildings-related efficiency, talks a little bit about system-level efficiency as well. It's a good place to start. But I wanted to talk about 5 big trends in DER real quick, and I've got 5 minutes to do it. So distributed solar policy and rate design, we had 47 states that took some kind of distributed solar policy rate design action in 2018. Net metering, net billing, buy all, sell all, these are kind of the different structures for a lot of the DG compensation mechanisms that you see out there. Everybody knows net metering, but once you start getting away from retail compensation, at least for the energy you use, you're no longer talking about net metering, you're talking about some form of net billing. And then you get into these buy all, sell all conversations where basically you're purchasing everything you use from the utility and selling everything you generate. If you look, this is kind of where a lot of those conversations are going. And what's interesting is we're starting to see more states shifting away from net metering and in the direction of these transition tariffs. This is 2018, or excuse me, April of 2019. This was 2015, where everything really looked like net metering. So a lot of conversation on where we're going in the future for DG compensation is around these compensation structures and tariffs. A bunch of bills in different states. This is a couple weeks old, so some of these bills may have actually played out by now, but you get the idea. You know, some kind of states that have made extreme changes. Nevada and Maine both got handed their butts back by the population of those states and wound up going back to full-scale net metering. Maybe a lesson there that if we're going to make changes, we shouldn't do it too abruptly. The public may not appreciate it. Why are these changes under consideration? Well, we talked about it. You know, the cost shifting is something that everybody worries about as the scale gets larger, but when it's a really small number of systems, this is negligible. And so the question is, when does it become a big enough problem to worry about? And I think that's where a lot of the debate comes from. There's other reasons that people get into, that you run into. And a lot of this discussion about where we go really centers around what's in and what's out of the calculation of the successor tariff. So these value of solar studies that we see are all over the map. This is just a list of studies that have done this calculation, and you can see that the numbers range from a low in South Carolina of less than 5 cents, oops, wait, the low is now Montana, which is even less than South Carolina, to a high of Maryland, which was about 36 cents. So depending on which state you're in, electrons have different values, apparently. Which is not tremendously surprising, but you know, I guess it's all a matter of where you stand depends on where you sit. Another trend, transportation electrification. We haven't talked as much about the transportation side. DOT's got a whole plan going on this front. A lot of actions around the country just in 2018 on that front. This is EV charging regulation, and so you can see a lot of states have already exempted charging stations from the definition of public utility. A lot of states have done it or are considering it as well. This is just one aspect of the EV deployment, but it's a key one that's under discussion in North Carolina right now. A lot going on this front, and I'm going to keep going because I'm running out of time. Addressing energy storage. You can see that there's a lot of activities on this front around the country. A lot of states are doing multiple activities on this front. Some of these actions, much the way that we structured our discussion here in North Carolina with the North Carolina storage study, are aimed at preparing for storage deployment, conducting studies, interconnection rules, things of that nature. Some at facilitating storage deployment, and some at accelerating with clean peak standards or other types of incentive programs. Developing community solar programs. This is another topic. You can see that almost every state has a utility at least that's involved in this conversation, and we've got about 19 states that have actually mandated something at the state level. A lot of those, again, mirrors the net metering conversation as to how they compensate people in the community solar conversation. There's a lot of different flavors of this. Different states have done more complicated or less complicated things. And there's also a lot of, in the community solar world, a lot of focus on low income, and so that is something where there's a lot of models to look at around the country. Community solar legislation is under consideration in a bunch more of states today, and so there's a lot of activity on this front. Last one I wanted to hit on just real quick, some innovative policy designs. There's a bunch of these, but I'll start with this Hawaii Smart Export Tariff is an interesting one. This is a tariff that they've designed where they have batteries at the site in the home, and they charge those batteries during the day, and the tariff is designed to pay them a higher rate to discharge at peak when the solar is not available in the evening. And so they actually get you know, a better tariff rate by exporting at a time when the grid needs it. So takeaways, just real quick. DERs, particularly solar and storage, are dropping in price rapidly and becoming more cost competitive, but we've still got a lot of behind-the-meter solutions work to do for residential and C&I particularly. because they remain significantly more expensive, and we probably need a lot more technology deployment to fix that. Net metering remains a key tool for emerging DER, but you know, if you get into bigger states where the market's more mature, there's probably less value in keeping that. And you know, these value of DER analyses for successor tariffs are all over the map. I'm not sure how we're going to get to a point where those are actually useful tools, because we don't seem to be able to agree on exactly what the tool is. And then last but not least, on the EVs and electrification options, there's a lot of activity, but rate structures and technology deployment to utilize the potential benefit, we have a long way to go. So lots of activity. Sorry that was a little bit rushed, but like I said, at least it wasn't 127 slides. I did whittle it back some. Thanks very much, and I'll wait to take questions at the end.
Good morning. My name is Ivan Urlaub. I'm Executive Director of a 41-year-old member-based nonprofit here in North Carolina called the North Carolina Sustainable Energy Association. And we have members ranging from consumers of various types and sizes across the state, local governments, institutions like academic institutions, some cooperative utilities, clean energy industry business members, and members from 23 states across the country, because there's a lot of people involved in North Carolina's energy market. From this, a little bit of background about our organization. We've been heavily engaged in policy in the state for much of our history, and so we know a lot of information about the patterns and structures, and have ideas about what mental models are in play in what you might call the arcane details of regulation as it happens around electricity, especially in North Carolina. So going to try to, we had to make a choice for today's presentation. There's a lot for us to talk about and explore and put on the table. The choice we made today in what to share and see what we want to talk about is to focus more on the question of how policy and technology are enabling procurement, as opposed to giving you charts and graphs about what's deployed in North Carolina. We're happy to follow up after today with any information that may be useful. Please feel free to reach out about any information about what's deployed out in North Carolina when it comes to distributed energy resources, renewables, storage, and so forth. We have information, not totally complete information, but we have a lot of information. What we do have, for example, taking the information that Steve was sharing and looking specifically at North Carolina and spatially across our state, here's a table down at the left to complement the map, and you can see the key in the upper left where the color tells you what type of renewable resource is deployed across the state. Solar is the lion's share of systems, 8,259. This information's a few weeks old. 3,874 megawatts. You're typically going to see two different numbers for megawatts reported for renewable energy, depending on whether the number you're looking at is alternating current or direct current, AC or DC. So lots of times people use whatever serves their goal. We just try to universally use one. Energy storage deployment is accelerating. This is not a comprehensive database of energy storage across the Southeast, but you did see, I saw in a map that Steve, you shared, I think it said something like 79 megawatts of storage in Florida, 32.9 maybe in North Carolina for either planned or in place. We also know that a number of businesses, especially that work on the distribution grid directly with customers, are deploying storage behind the meter, but aren't necessarily reporting it out. There's customers in South Carolina and North Carolina that have 14, 18 Tesla Powerwalls on their property right now. Very large properties that are residential. And it's just a little mind-boggling what's happening out there in the market right now. I'm going to skip over this. This is solar cost curves for the different types. Steve hit on this. We do have history in North Carolina with the cost of renewable energy resources and energy efficiency resources. We passed a law in 2007. Our electricity regulation in the state really dates back to the 1960s. We haven't done any kind of fundamental review and updating of it since then. What we have done is added on to it or carved out pieces of it to try to allow for innovation as it's come into the state and become more of an opportunity for utilities and industry and consumers to deploy into the market or to buy. A policy in 2007 called the Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency Portfolio Standard was an attempt to do what you could loosely term limited market competition, essentially try to take 12.5% of retail electricity sales in the state and say that it needs to be served by a combination of renewable energy and energy efficiency, which could include demand response programs. Exactly how the policy was designed to be flexible and allow those resource options to compete on cost. So originally we assumed it would be wood, co-fired in coal plants, and wind farms, and then energy efficiency for about 5% of the policy to get us into compliance in the year 2021 to be at that 12.5% mark. Solar, as we saw in the previous slides, came down dramatically in cost and started to become lower cost than those other resources, and an industry also with other regulatory policies was able to gain footholds, and in the period of 2010 to 2015 become so viable and vibrant under federal PURPA that it kind of freaked us out in the state. It was really calling into question whether or not the regulated utility was going to be able to meet its earnings targets, because we had not just hundreds of megawatts, but gigawatts, thousands of megawatts of solar showing up in the interconnection queue, and thousands more coming. And it was really jeopardizing kind of the traditional utility business model and way of business and market in North Carolina, and we didn't have answers for it. So we started to, in a very reactive way, respond to that. And that, along efficiency and solar, enabled us to comply with this law. And this line here is the cost cap we put on the policy, because we were so, kind of everyone was collectively concerned that we might exceed a cost and not be a least cost policy. This cost cap is based on what we expected business as usual to cost if we kept going with the utilities integrated resource plans, instead of doing 12.5% renewables and efficiency. This is what the actual costs were. So what we've seen in the state is we have this history, this experience, where we took a risk, we adopted more of an adaptive, flexible policy. The utilities had an option to do it all themselves. They largely opted not to. An industry stood up, became very vibrant. We went from about 430 companies in clean energy to about 1,700 over that period. And they competed on price and quality. A lot of contracts went into place called standard offer contracts for solar that largely helped compliance with this law. This is a simplified storage cost chart. Again, Steve showed you that the cost of storage has come down dramatically. The blue line is the cost decline. This slide, thanks to Southeast Wind Coalition for the chart and information on the right. And on the left is just some bullet points to think about offshore wind and solar, and then batteries. So what we're looking at is in Europe, from this chart provided, we're looking out at around year 2022, about 7.2 cents per kilowatt hour for systems that are forthcoming. So what are we looking at for 2025? North Carolina, after filtering out kind of all our concerns like fisheries, wind, military, et cetera, we still have north of 20,000 megawatts of offshore wind potential. We also are currently number 2, number 3, depending on your metric, in installed solar capacity or generation in the United States. Will that hold? We'll see. Everyone's doing a lot more. We haven't realized a lot of our efficiency potential, both in the grid and at the end use. So there's a lot of potential there, and batteries have come down in cost dramatically and are just coming onto the grid in North Carolina. We start to add up these costs. If in 2025 we're looking at solar in the ballpark of 3 cents per kilowatt hour, offshore wind in the 7 to 10 cents, let's say, something like that. And then batteries, what price range are those going to be in? We start to ask ourselves a very systemic question. Are we looking at massive, like gigawatts of least cost resource opportunity when we look at how they function together? Not independent of each other, but how they function together. And as we started to review this information in preparation for today, we said, we're really running into two things, from the most specific kind of arcane issue in an interconnection docket, or how we establish the avoided cost rate in the state, all the way up to the 15-year utility integrated resource plans, and bigger questions like plans for 2050. And we see two major dominant characteristics coming out for distributed energy resources, and we define it as including efficiency and demand response, utility scale renewables, and storage procurement. And it's not just by utilities, it's also customers, which have been procuring at an accelerating rate, and independent power producers, because there's a lot of power plants out there. There's thousands of them that aren't owned by utilities. One is, in North Carolina, we see time and again, policy has not kept pace with technology. I just gave you one example. Our electricity regulation framework was really set in the 1960s. Second is the brightest dividing line across the types of distributed energy resources, storage, renewables in North Carolina really seems to boil down to asset ownership. Time and again, if you start to unpack where there's a dispute, a disagreement, an opposition, it comes down to an argument over ownership. And a lot of the argumentation ties into who owns the asset. We think that's a symptom, not a problem. Ownership of the asset doesn't seem to be a problem. So unpacking that first one, policy really seems to be geared towards centralized and bulky resources, not distributed energy resources. Those have really come into being least cost, cost-effective, understanding how they impact reliability in the last decade in North Carolina. Policy implementation is accustomed to really considering one asset at a time, or one type of asset at a time. Should we build this natural gas plant? Should we build this gas peaker plant? Should we build another coal unit? Should we build a pipeline? So on and so forth. Instead of standing back, we don't have tools in the toolkit right now, either at the utility with integrated distribution planning or in the regulatory practice, to really look systemically at these resources. And the integrated resource plan itself is falling into enough question with other IRPs being generated to really question if the ones that are being filed are even viable and accurate in the resource assumptions they're making and the cost assumptions they're making. So our traditional cost of service regulation, the regulated utilities kind of left hand of generation, doesn't appear to be talking to its right hand of grid optimization. We're not pointing a finger at the utility, but simply pointing out the fact that we have an integrated resource plan that doesn't really talk about grid modernization, and we have legislation and rate cases that are talking a lot about grid modernization, optimization, but the two aren't meeting in the middle in the plans. So a few examples here. I'm not going to read all of this, but essentially this is the point I was just making. We do not have a planning process to look at the aggregate and integrated use of these grid assets. DERs can provide positive net value to the grid, such as avoided infrastructure investments, improved resilience, increased integration of clean energy, electric vehicles, so on and so forth. We really just don't have the tools, mechanisms, the transparent collaborative process to put all this on the table with the information in the state. So to answer the question that was posed to me today, how are we doing, where are we going, how is policy and technology driving procurement? Frankly, there's just not enough information being brought forward into the public sphere and visibility for us to be able to say we have an answer, but a lot of answers have been offered, and that's one of the challenges. I think I largely talked about this. We're considering one asset at a time. We're not looking at how these resources function as a whole. Duke's continued spending on centralized generation resources, so like power plants, there's 9,000 megawatts of new natural gas in the integrated resource plan, for example, is to accommodate distributed energy resources. That's the arguments that have been put forward. Also, Duke's spending to upgrade the grid has been argued to accommodate distributed energy resources, in part negating the need for 9,000 megawatts of new natural gas power plants. So we're kind of coming at it from two directions, and it's really unclear which plan is our plan. And our regulation and how we're implementing our policy doesn't give clear direction. So we have these two plans almost exclusive of each other, and both have really large price tags, and we probably don't need both. And in fact, we file Synapse Economics just did an alternative IRP that says we don't need to do both, and we can perform a lot better on cost and on maintain reliability and have a much cleaner portfolio if we enable ourselves to look systemically at how all these resources function together. So what we're running into in the second trend is disputes in utility proposals typically focus on asset and data ownership. So the arguments that have been put forward for about 10 years now is utility asset control is necessary. Only utility assets can maintain and protect reliability, not assets owned by other people. And the utility does oppose unfair cross-subsidy, reverse Robin Hood type arguments like tax credit, like rooftop solar. But when we unpack that, what we're running into, because we can't get past these arguments, because it's not really about ownership and reliability. What it really looks like it's about is that in all the instances where someone else owns the asset and it's their capital that's deployed, that spend is not eligible for the utility's rate of return that it can earn, which helps it hit its earnings target for its shareholders. And we think that is why we're talking about ownership, and why when something is owned by someone else, it's somehow potentially risky or harmful, is it's harmful to the earnings of the utility. We need to resolve this, because this is how the regulation has set us up to have this disconnect where technology has shown up and policy hasn't kept pace. So a lot of customers want to adopt or are adopting distributed energy resources. It can be much more cost effective for them, but we're not putting the tools in place, the planning in place, the regulatory policies in place, and the implementation processes in place for us to actually say, what does it mean for all of us to these questions? Like, what is the least cost system approach that maintains reliability and is resilient? We have things in front of the commission where people claim that they've answered that question, but it really begs the question, can we even answer that question with the tools we're using right now? And what's the most cost-effective manner of planning and deployment for grid efficiency and economic efficiency? Again, we're using so few tools in such limited scope that we're not even really looking at the assets that are behind the meter. Efficiency, demand response, renewables, EVs, and actually dynamically planning for them now and in the future. So this is our conclusion, really, that we need to address that. Affordable and reliable clean energy deployment or utility profits is not it's not necessary that we force that choice. Right now, our conversations and a lot of the disputes that are often coming into the media, showing up in legislation, are really rooted in our current regulation seems to be forcing this choice, and it's resulting in a lot of customers saying they can't do what they want to do with distributed energy resources, with efficiency, demand response, renewables, EVs. And the utilities really, the regulated utilities really seeming to be trying to craft within very tight bands and limitations on them and their utility business things that can kind of clear the regulatory hurdles so that they can spend and qualify for their rate of return and deliver. And that's an extremely multi-year slow process. So we have this disconnect where technology is already in the market, it's accelerating, it's promising least cost, and we're not seeing it in the utilities plans, almost none of the distribution in the utilities plans. And really quick, this is the utilities IRP. The DEC and DEP energy mix in 2019, 2033, I apologize, this is so small. Essentially you have nuclear, combined cycle natural gas as two big chunks, energy efficiency, DSM, and you see those changes year to year. And this is when you take nuclear out. And then this is what the Synapse Economics says. So we could go from really 23% natural gas down to 9% so only building a small portion of what's been proposed, and relying a lot more on energy imports because there's cheaper energy available for us to import, and then renewables. Storage, 3%, up from 1%. Essentially what you have is the Duke IRP right now says about 23% renewables and storage by 2033. This says 49% at $1.5 billion less cost and half the greenhouse gas emissions with same reliability. Not arguing for this, but trying to share this contrast because it begs the question, why wasn't something closer to this what Duke filed in its integrated resource plan? And what considerations and what questions do we need to ask? Is this fallacious? Or is it real and there's something that needs to change about policy and how it's implemented to catch up with technology so that we see plans that harness more of distributed energy resources, efficiency, demand response as this does. Again, happy to follow up with any charts, graphs, and data sets information. Thank you.
All right, my name is Charlie Bayless, and I'm from the Electric Cooperatives. I do not have any slides, so you're just going to have to look at me the whole time. Should have worn I have a bright orange tie. That would have really made everyone stare at me this morning. So I was just going to get up and talk about the cooperatives, what our two previous presenters talked about, and sort of the cooperative perspective on things. But first, for those of you that don't know, I'll give a little overview of the cooperatives. I work for a company called North Carolina Electric Membership Corporation, and there are 26 distribution cooperatives in the state of North Carolina, and they are pretty much spread throughout the state. They're located in 93 of the 100 counties in the state. And the distribution cooperatives are owned by the actual consumer. The consumer who pays the bill every month is the owner of the cooperatives. They have capital credits. They elect the board of directors of the cooperative, who elect the CEO and the executives of the cooperative. So it really is a bottoms-up approach. The cooperatives range in size from over 100,000 customers north of Charlotte to only 7,000 customers out in Cape Hatteras. So you have varying different sizes. And you have Roanoke and Halifax, which is sort of northeast North Carolina, very rural. Then we have Union Power, which used to be the outskirts of Charlotte, which is now very suburban, or Wake EMC, which is in Wake Forest, North Carolina, which when they started were very rural areas and now are very suburban areas. So we cover everything from the farmlands to the cities, and big to small. So we have a lot of diversity in what our members want. Some of our members want EVs in the very suburban areas. Others are more focused on agriculture. So we have to model our programs to satisfy each of the member needs. Now, the company I work for, NCMC, provides power to those 26 co-ops. So they don't have to, a lot of them have some power of their own. They have, I'll get into some solar, some storage, but we're really, NCMC is the bulk supplier of power to those 26 co-ops. Now, I'm going to talk a little about cost trends. As we've heard before, renewable prices are dropping. I think they're going to continue to drop. And this drop is just going to keep increasing the rate of renewable penetration. Renewables are just going to escalate over the coming years. I see a pullback in coal. There's people that I see in the co-op world, not in North Carolina, that thinks coal is going to have a resurgence. I just can't see it. Coal is pretty much dead. The one thing I think we are going to see is a gas build out. Renewables do need backup, and that can be provided by storage, a lot of batteries. But in the short term, I don't think we can build enough batteries to provide that. So I think we're going to see somewhat of a backup gas as renewables increase. There will be some gas built to provide up and down generation for that renewable as a backup. But overall, renewables, not only because of cost, but customer preference is also driving renewables. Customers want renewables. A lot of our members want renewables, and is those, especially for co-ops, since they are the owners of the systems, is those customers want renewables. We, NCMC and the distribution co-ops, will continue to build renewables to satisfy that demand for customers. Now, along with renewables, DER deployment. I think it's pretty much site specific. What works in one area will not work in another. I'll use two totally different situations. You look at Tucson or Phoenix, Arizona. What you have in Tucson or Phoenix, Arizona, you have sun all the time. You could probably get by pretty reliably on solar plus batteries out there. That's not going to work in Cleveland, Ohio, where the sun in the winter only shines once every 6 days, if you're lucky. So the renewables are really going to be site specific. What works in one place for type of renewables, renewable mix, is going to be completely different in another place, just depending on the characteristics. EVs are really growing, especially in the suburban areas outside around cities like Raleigh. EVs are growing, and NCMC sees a lot of this growth. NCMC has developed 2 microgrid sites. One out in Ocracoke Island, which is combined with some gas diesels we have out there. We have renewable solar and a few kilowatts of battery out there on Ocracoke Island, and also another microgrid in the center part of the state on a hog farm, Butler Farms. Some of our distribution co-ops are also partnering with communities. Brunswick EMC is partnering with a housing development to combine solar storage at the house and at a centralized site. So it's sort of a little microgrid for this housing community. So I think we're going to see things like that pop up in the future. Is customers desire these types of houses. They have solar plus storage in the house, plus another centralized solar plus storage in the community, which can provide energy for the community whenever the power goes out, or help cut the peak, or whatever that desire may be. So we're looking at that. Let's see, NCMC is also looking into energy efficiency as well. We have programs for thermostats and water heaters. We combined with, we're working with Nest and Ecobee for programs where we can integrate these. And all these programs are really trying to get, we need to get educated right now on how the utilities need education on how to integrate this into our plans, because this technology is only continue to grow. The penetration of solar storage, thermostats, water heaters, EVs are going to continue to grow. So we need to understand how to integrate this into the system for when it goes from 1% to 5% to 10%, to take care of these trends and learn how to optimize this. Now, as far as compensation goes, I think we have a responsibility to look at this in a sort of least cost method. And when I say that, utilities don't sell just electrons. We sell what I'll call highly refined electrons. They need to meet a reliability criteria of 1 day in 10 years. Now, to meet that, you need reserves, you need backup, and different sources of generation have different needs. And I think when you look at two different case studies, I'm going to use Germany and Ontario, the way they did it. Everyone out here is probably familiar with what happened in Germany. Germany went big into renewables, and they had a feed-in tariff, and it got a lot of renewables. Germany really increased the renewables several times over. I can't remember exactly how many percent renewables Germany has, but they are one of the leaders in the world right now. But Ontario did something very similar. They wanted to go into renewables, but instead of a feed-in tariff and just asking people to build, Ontario went out and did a 2-year comprehensive study. And basically the study said, okay, we need 7,000 megawatts of renewable. What is the very optimal place to locate those renewables in a cost-efficient manner? And they said, well, it's cheapest to put them 200 miles away from load, but then we're going to have to build 200 miles of transmission. Or we could build them here, but it's in a congested area. So it's not going to be as efficient to put the renewables here 50 miles from load, but the overall cost is a lot less. So they both went about it, both countries, or province and country, went about trying to increase renewables, but they did in two completely different methods. And Ontario was able to get by with a cost increase of just a few percent, where Germany probably had a 30-40%, and they both were able to meet the renewable goals of 30-40% renewables. Just one did it in a very planned out economic manner, and the other did it just letting companies build where they wanted to. So I think as North Carolina plans for the future, we need to sort of step back and look exactly how we want to integrate renewables. We absolutely have to integrate renewables because they're coming for a number of reasons, but we need to do it in a cost-effective, responsible manner. And finally, I think the last thing is to talk about sort of flexibility, and the flexibility that's needed because of renewables. Right now, the big sort of swing is on the demand side of things. People turn on and off light switches. Utilities have been planning for people turning off light switches, ovens, things like that for a century now. We know how to plan around it. But because of renewables, the sort of supply side variability is going to exceed the demand side variability in the upcoming years by many factors. GE said it could be 40% or 40 times the supply side variability as demand side variability. One of the things NCEMC is doing is starting a distribution organization right now to try to take a look at all the thermostats, water heaters, and control those devices and to optimize them. And this is basically about optimizing the system. One day a battery may be used, the best source for that battery may be to control variability on the system because of the intermittency of renewables. The next day, the best use for that battery may be to cut the peak. And the third day, it may be voltage control. And these systems that NCEMC and other utilities are developing, San Diego Gas and Electric has one, is to really optimize the system. Take a look at all the different renewables, all the different devices out there on the system, and try to connect them all together and control them as a whole to keep prices down as much as possible for the consumers. That is all I have.
Thanks again to Steve, Ivan, and Charles. So now we're going to have a Q&A session for 10 minutes. So can I ask two of my colleagues to grab mics and run? So does anybody have any questions for our speakers?
So it's a pretty convincing case we heard from, I think, all of you about the need for an integrated system where the DERs are communicating with the grid and the devices that are placing the load, even down at the household level. So my question is, where do privacy concerns factor into all this?
Okay, they're big, and we've got to figure them out. Right now, a lot of the companies NCMC is working for, Nest and Ecobee, provide aggregated data. We need to figure out. A lot of these devices are connected to the internet, and internet security is going to be a big part of that. Making sure that no one can steal the data right off of your device through your connection to your home wireless network and things like that. NCMC has, there's model rules out there for companies like Nest and Ecobee. And NCMC, as far as our company goes, has all of our vendors of our CDSS systems and things like that go through cybersecurity criteria. We have a questionnaire that companies have to fill out to make sure that all the companies we're working with have cybersecurity measures in place to prevent theft and things like that. But you know, the other part is, like I said, in the home, making sure that no one steals your information before it even gets to Nest or Ecobee or whomever the data is going to.
I guess the only thing I would add is the reverse side of that coin. There's a lot of innovation that could take place with more transparency of data. That has to be done in a way that protects consumers, but we got a lot of work to do, and there's a lot of innovative companies out there that if they had, you know, access to aggregated data that was not, you know, identified to the individual customer, but gave us, you know, the tools that we need to be able to do modeling work, to develop control systems, applications that help us to better manage energy use. There's a lot of slack in the system to be gained there. And so, you know, we have a lot of concerns about privacy of individuals in almost everything that's a public policy discussion. That has to be balanced with the need for transparency in almost every conversation that we have around public policy. This is no different, and so we just need to find that. Some of those are engineering issues. Some of those are, you know, pieces of the puzzle that we can address through policies. But if we don't get increased transparency of data, it's going to be a lot harder to do what we need to do, especially on the energy efficiency side.
And just one other instruction, if you could note if you have a specific question for one of the speakers or just for the panel in general, I think that would be good as well. Next question.
Yeah, I had a question about Ontario, which sounds like an interesting model. The question I have is can North Carolina emulate that in any way by bringing all the stakeholders together to have that discussion about what the right approach should be, you know, developing that plan? It seems like we have a lot of disparate views about how to move forward.
Yeah, unfortunately, there's not a lot of information out there about Ontario. So I've sort of got bits and pieces of it together. I really wish there was more out there to do a case study about. As far as I can tell, the utility did most of the work. They're the ones that sort of did the cost-benefit analysis to determine, you know, okay, we need, to meet our goal, we need 8,000 megawatts. This is the most economic place to put it. Then they put that out for bid. You know, we need 1,000 megawatts here, come give us your bids. Yeah, I think it could work through a stakeholder process. The more people you have involved, the more cumbersome you have involved. I mean, I don't think, I think it does need to be bigger than just the utility, but finding that mix is always a delicate, you know, proposition.
I mean, one thing I would add is this is kind of that stakeholder process, right? We're kind of working toward that now. And so, you know, it does need to be bigger than just the utility. I saw some eyebrows go up at that. I think we all would acknowledge that, right? Yeah. Absolutely. And I think this is the kind of stakeholder group that walks us down that path. I think in the end, the Ontario discussion, you know, is a conversation about moving towards increasing flexibility of the system using renewables. You know, Charlie rightly alluded earlier to the fact that renewables are causing us to have more work to do with the grid right now. But, you know, if you can specify the system in a way that makes the most sense, you can actually increase the flexibility of the system by the use of renewables and distributed energy resources, and that's really where we need to be headed. Again, we got a lot of work to do to get there.
I guess this question is for Ivan. You talked pretty convincingly about the need for an integrated distribution strategy or integrated distribution plan, and the fact that there's a disconnect between that and the IRP. What, in your view, is the role of the Utility Commission and the governor who appoints members to the Utility Commission? What's their role in helping bringing that about, and what's the role of the governor in finding people who understand those issues in order to appoint them to the Utility Commission?
Well, that's probably the role of the governor to find people that understand those issues and appoint them to the Utilities Commission. So right now, it's can be argued either way, that, for example, economic considerations, environmental considerations, social considerations are outside the authority of the commission. We've had sitting commissioners over the last 15 years argue both ways. It's either in their authority or not. And in any given year or term, the commission may take up those issues and in another term may not. And so that's been confusing, I think, for all involved. I think that probably one of the best things that would be a shift for North Carolina is more dialogue, more kind of asking questions before a decision is requested of the commission. And so, and the commission can do that. The commission could say, hey, we're going to have what they call a docket, right? Assign it a number, open a proceeding, but also then establish a process where they can invite folks to say, we want this question to be before us. We want everyone to bring their best and brightest ideas, needs, challenges, utility, consumer, other providers. And in those kinds of dialogue, I think we could see a lot of really fantastic cost-effective approaches surface. It could really help us clarify our understanding of what additional tools we need in our toolkit as regulator and in terms of planning to answer questions that are coming up through this process. Hopefully that helps. I know it's really high level.
We'll make this the last question, then we'll move on.
Thank you. This question's for Ivan, although I'd welcome responses from anyone. It seems we just keep coming back to one essential issue over and over again, which is how North Carolina incentivizes the utilities to meet their earning targets. As I understand it, based on rate of return on capital expenditures, et cetera. Also, our utility commission, as was just pointed out, is appointed, not elected, which makes them to some extent a creature of the legislature. Where do we fit in the big picture? Are other states, are we the norm? Are we the exception? Are other states moving away, modernizing their incentives to utilities where there are regulated monopolies? That's my question.
Well, certainly, I'll look to my fellow panelists as well. I can offer that it's uncommon to have so many commissioners. We have 7. not many commissions have that many commissioners. Some commissions have extremely robust tools at their disposal, such as an ability to test, validate, recreate a utility integrated resource plan. Ours does not, as far as I'm aware. So they're much less like an integrated distribution plan or to test, validate assumptions. So there's a great dependence on external resources. States across the country are engaging in various investigatory processes where they're asking these questions either because it was directed by a legislature or it was within the authority of the commission to ask questions. Some are going ahead and trying ideas, creating various rulemakings, allowing utilities to move forward with trying certain things. I imagine there's speakers later in the day on the agenda that can also answer this question more robustly than I am.
I know you guys want to move on, but just real quick, I wanted to add, the big difference between our state and a lot of the states that have, that are probably further down this curve is that we really are structured from a policy standpoint in favor of large. And, you know, I drew this on my artwork back there, you know. We're a state that really orients from a policy standpoint towards larger systems, and the DER systems, you know, the rooftop systems, the near load systems, the behind the meter systems, our policy structure is really not well set up for that. And that's true in much of the Southeast and in, you know, other traditionally regulated states. But there's a lot of value in those distributed systems. You know, you avoid some of these congestion problems if you can put the generation at the point of load. There's a lot of value to being able to, you know, put those systems in from a, you know, economic development standpoint. You know, there's higher paying jobs associated with roofers and plumbers and electricians that are in those systems rather than in lower skilled jobs that are basically humping panel after panel off a truck and then bolting it into a rack out in the middle of nowhere. And so there's just a very different fundamental structure from a policy regulatory framework in states that have more balanced markets that kind of balance the utility scale conversation with the DER market. And that's probably the biggest difference between us and some of these other areas of the country where there's a more advanced or more robust conversation here.
I do want to add one note because this is really arcane, but I think it matters a lot. Through discovery process in the rate cases, we were looking at the criterion on which utility employees' compensation, their performance criteria. And really, they're all oriented towards supporting earnings attainment. And so, again, I don't think there's any blaming or anything going on here. It's just such a narrow focus. And hence, that's also why I talked today about earnings. So where other states do consider other things, other targets to be performing toward, and the prompt that I received for talking today was what trends in policy and technology are impacting, kind of affecting the procurement of clean energy in the state. And so if clean energy paid for and installed by an entity other than the utility, often behind the meter, is something that we generally say our regulated utility can't do in our state, and when it does happen, diminishes their revenue and their ability to achieve their earnings, then we see things like opposition over something like a common policy like third-party sales that's allowed in other states, is an extremely intense conversation and an oppositional conversation here in North Carolina. And so that's why I'm elevating kind of the earnings question to help us kind of give us at least something to focus on that is an established performance criterion to unpack that and say, what do we want to perform toward? What do we all want to be contributing toward, achieving, and performing toward? And let's ask, how can earnings happen in a way that we can achieve whatever we want to be performing toward? And our commission, I think some in our commission believe they're allowed to ask that question today, and others think they need some kind of legislative directive to give them the authority to explore that question today.
All right, thank you. Another round of applause for our panelists, please.